Triple H just made the most controversial and franchise-altering decision in WWE history by permanently firing Brock Lesnar following his vicious assault on Bronson Reed. And if you're not absolutely stunned that WWE just terminated their biggest draw and most marketable superstar over a backstage incident, you clearly don't understand the magnitude of this career-ending bombshell that's sending shockwaves through the entire wrestling industry. What we're witnessing isn't just disciplinary action, it's the complete destruction of the Beast Incarnate's legacy and the definitive end of an era that defined WWE for over 2 decades. The sight of Triple H standing at an emergency press conference with a grave expression, announcing that Brock Lesnar's contract has been terminated effective immediately with no possibility of reinstatement, will be remembered as one of the most shocking executive decisions in wrestling history. This wasn't a suspension, a fine, or a cooling-off period. This was permanent termination that ends Brock's WWE career in absolute disgrace and controversy. Brock Lesnar's actions crossed every line of acceptable professional conduct, and WWE cannot and will not tolerate behavior that puts our performers' lives at risk, regardless of that person's star power or historical significance to this company. Triple H's words weren't just corporate damage control, they were a declaration that no wrestler, no matter how legendary or financially valuable, is above accountability for their actions. The finality in his voice made it crystal clear this decision is irreversible. You want to talk about decisions that fundamentally reshape WWE's landscape and force a complete re-evaluation of the company's priorities? Triple H didn't just discipline Brock, he eliminated the company's most physically dominant force, their biggest pay-per-view attraction, and arguably the most legitimate combat sports athlete in wrestling history. The financial, creative, and historical implications of this termination are absolutely staggering beyond measure. The assault that triggered this unprecedented termination was so savage and potentially career-ending for Bronson Reed that WWE executives reportedly had unanimous agreement that immediate and severe action was the only acceptable response. When your biggest star puts another performer in the hospital with serious injuries, you either take decisive action or admit publicly that star power matters more than human safety and basic decency. But here's what makes this termination absolutely unprecedented and different from any previous WWE firing. Brock Lesnar has been the company's protected golden asset for years, receiving special treatment, preferential scheduling, and leniency that absolutely no other performer enjoys or has ever enjoyed. The fact that Triple H was willing to sacrifice that massive investment and accept the enormous financial consequences shows exactly how serious and inexcusable the situation became. The most shocking aspect of this decision is the timing and the business implications. Brock was scheduled for multiple high-profile matches, major storyline commitments, and championship opportunities that are now completely destroyed and must be rewritten. WWE is literally throwing away guaranteed millions in ticket sales, pay-per-view revenue, and merchandise income because Triple H decided that protecting performer safety and maintaining ethical standards matters fundamentally more than protecting short-term profit margins. Here's a question that's going to reveal the full business magnitude of this unprecedented decision. How many tens of millions of dollars in direct revenue and indirect value do you estimate WWE just sacrificed by firing their most reliable main event attraction and box office draw? The actual termination meeting was reportedly explosive, confrontational, and deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Sources describe Brock initially refusing to accept the decision's legitimacy, becoming increasingly agitated and hostile, and eventually having to be physically escorted from WWE headquarters by multiple security personnel after making explicit threats against company executives and specifically Triple H personally. The footage of Brock leaving WWE headquarters surrounded by a security detail, screaming obscenities, and making threatening gestures toward the building, provides a disturbing glimpse into the Beast's mental state and complete inability to accept responsibility. This isn't someone who made a regrettable mistake and feels genuine remorse, this is someone who genuinely believes he did nothing wrong and that WWE is somehow betraying him rather than holding him accountable. But the most devastating and relationship-ending moment came when Paul Heyman, Brock's closest confidant, longest-tenured advocate, and the one person who has defended him through every controversy for over 20 years, publicly supported Triple H's termination decision. As much as it genuinely pains me to say this, Brock's actions left WWE absolutely no choice whatsoever, Heyman said in an official statement that shocked the wrestling world. What happened to Bronson Reed was completely inexcusable and indefensible, and I cannot and will not attempt to defend the truly indefensible. Quick question for the relationship dynamics experts: what does it say about the absolute severity and inexcusable nature of Brock's actions that even Paul Heyman, his most loyal supporter and closest friend for 2 decades, refused to defend him and actually supported his permanent termination? The most infuriating aspect for the relatively few remaining Brock supporters is that this termination appears to be absolutely permanent with explicitly no possibility of future reinstatement under any circumstances. Triple H made it abundantly clear in multiple statements that this isn't a storyline angle, isn't a temporary punishment that ends with an emotional reunion, and isn't a negotiating tactic. Brock Lesnar's WWE career is definitively over with no potential path back to the company ever. The investigation into what specifically made Triple H take such extreme and irreversible action reveals that Bronson Reed's injuries were significantly more severe than initially reported to the public. Confidential medical evaluations apparently suggest potential permanent nerve damage, chronic pain issues that may never fully resolve, and the genuinely terrifying possibility that Reed may never wrestle at his previous elite level again if he can physically continue wrestling at all. But perhaps the most shocking factor that sealed Brock's fate was the legal liability and insurance implications WWE faces if they had retained him as an employee. Multiple insurance companies, corporate legal counsel, and risk management consultants all apparently provided urgent recommendations for immediate termination to minimize the company's catastrophic exposure to potential multi-million-dollar lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and insurance coverage cancellations. The cold corporate calculation reveals that keeping Brock employed would have created such massive legal and financial risk that it completely outweighed his substantial value as a performer and attraction. When your insurance carriers explicitly threaten to drop coverage if you continue employing someone with a documented history of workplace violence, the business decision becomes obvious regardless of any personal feelings or historical loyalty. Here's another question for the business risk analysts. Do you think Triple H made this termination decision purely for ethical and safety reasons, or was it driven primarily by legal and financial considerations that made retaining Brock simply too dangerous and expensive for the company? The most controversial aspect of this termination is how it happened so rapidly without the extended investigation, appeals process, or progressive discipline that typically accompanies major employment decisions. Brock was terminated within approximately 72 hours of the assault incident, strongly suggesting that WWE viewed the situation as so unambiguous and severe that normal due process procedures could be completely bypassed in favor of immediate action. The testimonies from wrestlers who personally witnessed the assault apparently left absolutely no doubt whatsoever about Brock's complete culpability, deliberate intent, and reckless disregard for Reed's safety. Multiple veteran performers gave detailed official statements describing how Brock systematically and deliberately targeted Bronson's vulnerable spine and neck areas with techniques specifically designed and calculated to cause maximum damage, making this clearly intentional assault rather than just overly aggressive or reckless wrestling. But the most disturbing evidence that sealed Brock's fate came from comprehensive security footage showing his demeanor and calculated behavior during the sustained attack. The video apparently reveals the cold, methodical way he systematically destroyed Reed while deliberately ignoring multiple referees' increasingly desperate attempts to stop the assault, demonstrating someone who had complete control of his actions and made conscious, deliberate choices to inflict serious harm despite repeated opportunities to stop. The psychological evaluation that WWE apparently conducted immediately after the incident concluded that Brock represents an ongoing and unacceptable danger to other performers based on his demonstrated inability to control aggressive impulses and his complete absence of remorse or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The clinical assessment suggested that his psychological state creates unmanageable risk that WWE simply cannot address through normal disciplinary measures or behavioral modification programs. The fan reaction to Brock's termination has been absolutely explosive and dramatically divided along clear lines. Some substantial segment of fans are praising Triple H for courageously prioritizing performer safety and ethical standards over profit maximization, while another significant group is accusing WWE of gross overreaction and destroying Brock's legacy over what they characterize as one isolated incident that occurred during the heat of competition. Here's a question about competing priorities and values. Do you personally support Triple H's decision to permanently fire Brock despite the enormous financial and creative damage it causes to WWE? Or do you think the company overreacted to an incident that should have been handled through suspension and mandatory counseling rather than career-ending termination? The most shocking response has come from other major wrestling companies and promotions who are reportedly unanimously refusing to even consider hiring Brock despite his sudden availability and proven drawing power. AEW, NJPW, Impact Wrestling, and virtually every significant independent promotion have all apparently indicated through various channels that they will not pursue Brock due to the documented severity of his actions and the massive liability concerns that employing him would create for their organizations. The investigation into why the entire wrestling industry is apparently blacklisting Brock reveals that WWE took the extraordinary and unprecedented step of confidentially sharing comprehensive medical documentation and detailed legal analysis with other major promotions as a professional courtesy. This remarkable cooperation between typically competitive organizations suggests that wrestling companies collectively view Brock's conduct as so serious and dangerous that they need to present an unified front of accountability. But perhaps the most devastating long-term consequence for Brock personally is that his termination likely immediately voids numerous endorsement deals, appearance contracts, and licensing agreements that contain standard morality clauses. When major corporate sponsors learn that you were permanently fired for putting someone in the hospital with potentially career-ending injuries, they universally and predictably distance themselves very quickly to protect their own brand reputations and avoid association with workplace violence. The financial implications of simultaneously losing WWE salary, future wrestling bookings from all major promotions, and virtually all endorsement income could cost Brock conservatively estimated tens of millions of dollars over just the next several years alone. What appeared to be a brief moment of uncontrolled rage has systematically destroyed his entire earning potential and potentially bankrupted his long-term financial security and retirement planning. The most infuriating discovery that has emerged is that this assault on Bronson Reed may not have been Brock's first incident of excessive and dangerous workplace violence. Confidential sources reveal that WWE has extensive documentation of multiple previous incidents where Brock's aggression clearly crossed professional lines but was systematically covered up, minimized, or excused specifically because of his exceptional star power and revenue generation. Here's a critical question about institutional responsibility and enablement. If WWE knew about and documented previous incidents of excessive violence from Brock over the years, do they bear significant moral and legal responsibility for enabling his behavior by not taking appropriate action much sooner before someone got seriously hurt? The testimonies from wrestlers who have worked directly with Brock over many years paint a deeply disturbing picture of someone whose violence and aggression have been steadily escalating for an extended period. We all knew Brock had serious anger management issues and frequently didn't properly control his tremendous strength, one respected veteran revealed anonymously. The Bronson Reed attack was genuinely shocking in its severity but honestly not surprising as an eventual outcome. It felt like something that was inevitably going to happen eventually given the warning signs we'd all been seeing. The clear pattern of systematically escalating violence over time suggests that Brock's termination, while specifically triggered by the Reed assault, was actually the inevitable culmination of years of increasingly concerning behavior that WWE repeatedly chose to ignore, excuse, or cover up. The Reed incident became the final straw rather than representing an isolated occurrence completely out of character. But the most controversial conspiracy theory gaining traction is that Triple H may have actually been actively looking for sufficient justification to terminate Brock's contract for unrelated business reasons. Sources suggest that the game viewed Brock's part-time schedule, creative inflexibility, and massive salary demands as fundamental problems for WWE's long-term strategic direction, and the Reed attack provided the perfect legally defensible excuse to end a business relationship that wasn't working optimally anyway. The investigation into backstage power dynamics reveals that Triple H and Brock had apparently been experiencing significant ongoing tensions over creative control, scheduling commitments, and strategic direction for many months before this incident. The termination might have been completely justified and necessitated by the Reed attack, but underlying business and creative tensions suggest it represented an outcome that both parties might have eventually desired anyway under different circumstances. The most important broader consideration is what this precedent-setting termination means for WWE's future organizational culture and behavioral standards. By permanently firing their biggest star explicitly for violent workplace conduct, Triple H has sent an unmistakably clear message that the company is fundamentally prioritizing long-term institutional sustainability, performer safety, and ethical standards over short-term profits, nostalgia, and individual star power. Here's a philosophical question for the wrestling community: is WWE objectively better off without Brock Lesnar if it means establishing the principle that absolutely no performer is above accountability regardless of their value? Or did they just eliminate their single most valuable asset over an incident that could potentially have been addressed through less extreme measures? The coming weeks and months will reveal whether this termination ultimately stands as Triple H's defining moment of principled leadership that transforms WWE culture, or becomes a decision he eventually regrets when financial reports clearly reflect Brock's substantial absence from major events. Either way, the wrestling landscape has been permanently and fundamentally altered in ways we're only beginning to understand. WWE has made the absolutely unprecedented decision to permanently terminate Brock Lesnar despite his exceptional star power and proven drawing ability, sending an unmistakable message that performer safety and ethical accountability matter more than profits or nostalgia. The Beast Incarnate's career is definitively over. Bronson Reed is fighting to recover from potentially permanent injuries, and the wrestling world is struggling to process the full magnitude of this shocking and franchise-altering development. Brock Lesnar is terminated with no possibility of return, his once legendary legacy is forever tainted by how his career ended, and WWE is boldly moving forward without their most physically dominant force, definitively proving that in Triple H's radically transformed WWE, absolutely nobody is above accountability regardless of how much money they generate, how many championships they've held, or how legendary their accomplishments might be.